I'd like to talk today about attitudes towards species that, for one reason or another, have relocated, changed their habitat, moved, migrated, or resettled in another environment. And more specifically, what we would like to discuss is how this movement of species, and in particular we'll be talking about plants today, has been addressed by contemporary artists. And this includes the parallels that a lot of artists have drawn between hostile attitudes to migrating plants and xenophobia towards migrants, travelers, refugees, and just foreigners in general as well. And so of concern here is also the extent to which climate change is really changing the dynamics of species migration. And at the same time, also climate change is also transforming attitudes to so-called invasive species. And above all, what we'd be interested in doing here is maybe to shed some light on the different ways in which artists have uncovered the complex histories of more than human migrations, and also the way artists have explored the agency of non-native pioneers in restoring and revivifying devastated post-industrial landscapes. So just to start with, maybe we could look back a little bit to the origins of this hostility towards migrating, incoming, newcomer species. And we could look back to the scientific culture of the Cold War, and especially to the scientific sub-branch called invasion biology. And a key moment in the development of such attitudes was the publication of a book by British biologist Charles Elton called Ecology of Invasions of Animals and Plants, which he published in 1958. And perhaps it's worth just reading the beginning, so the first paragraph of the first chapter of his book, just to get a little bit of a feel for the atmosphere of Cold War peril, of fear that infused what you would think of as, which maybe you would expect to be objective scientific thinking, or at the time in this positivist atmosphere they imagined as objective thinking. But today you can really feel the sort of the emotions and fears, I think, behind that. So I'll just read this as well. You can read it at the same time. So nowadays we live in a very explosive world. And while we may not know where or when the next outburst will be, we might hope to find ways of stopping it, or at any rate damping down its force. It's not just nuclear bombs and wars that threaten us, though these rank very high on the list at the moment. There are other sorts of explosions, and this book is about ecological explosions. An ecological explosion means the enormous increase in numbers of some kind of living organism. It may be an infectious virus like influenza, or a bacterium like bubonic plague, or a fungus like that of the potato disease, a green plant like the prickly pear, or an animal like the grey squirrel. I use the word explosion deliberately because it means the bursting out from control of forces that were previously held in restraint by other forces. Indeed, the word was originally used to describe the barracking of actors by an audience, whom they were no longer able to restrain by the quality of their performance. So, I mean, I think you can feel quite strongly just reading that paragraph. It also resonates with the current situation, with thinking of COVID, but also the kind of fears also that we're living with, this kind of return of global fears at the moment in the present day. So while in the West at that time, especially in the 50s and 60s, scientific rhetoric about the threat posed by invasive species was effectively interlaced with these kind of visceral fears about the spread of communism to the workers. So there was this fear that communism could spread to the workers of the capitalist world. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, exaggerated concern with invasive species also coalesced with Cold War paranoia about the threat of unconventional military threats. And notably, this battle against non-native species found its way also into the thematic framework of socialist realist art. And for example here, of Anton Duračka's Spraying the Colorado Beetle with Pesticide from 1954. And as you can see, it depicted bare-chested workers on top of a tractor spraying this kind of a haze of pesticides over infested potato fields in this heroic effort to eradicate the Colorado beetle from the territories of what was then communist Czechoslovakia. And apart from the sort of socialist realist aspects of the work of the heroic farmers, and the fact that it really is extraordinary. It really visualizes this spraying this herbicides. It's also interesting to think about maybe just to remember the campaign that and the spheres of the Colorado beetle. So this campaign against the potato beetle was used as I suppose a propaganda tool by the authorities, who spread the message through newsreels and leaflets that the insect was being dropped on Eastern Europe as a weapon of war. Again, some strange contemporary echoes. So this is what you can see is a still from a Czechoslovak television broadcast from the period, which declared to a background of an overcast sky that the American imperialists have sent potato beetles by clouds and air to our republic, while footage of men spraying pesticides onto crops accompanied the promise that we will protect and clean our fields of the American plague. And there were similar fears and campaigns also in Poland and other countries of Eastern Europe. And although in terms of facts, although the potato beetle did find its way to Europe after World War I and began to multiply and disperse in the following decades, there's no evidence that it was used as a biological weapon during the Cold War. And the fact that it did spread through socialist fields, you could look for some more kind of environmental causes in the switch towards collective farms, like big fields, getting rid of hedgerows and so on, which reduced the number of birds and so created environmental conditions which allowed the pest to spread. And going back to more recent times, it's quite interesting that these kind of Cold War attitudes to newcomer species also survived the end of the Cold War and went into the era of neoliberal globalization. And so even in 1997, these people, invasion biologists, were still talking about an army of invasive plant and animal species overrunning the United States, causing incalculable economic and ecological costs. And in this article here, the authors also singled out the zebra mussel as a particularly harmful alien conqueror, which they point out originated in the former Soviet Union. So, somehow this kind of Cold War threat continues into the post-Cold War era. And I think even it's funny, the banner of this scientific journal also has this atmosphere, secretive, polarized atmosphere of Cold War culture. Now, in more recent times, scientific circles have turned against the precepts of invasion biology, and they've discredited this movement, or this sub-branch of biology, saying that it's very similar to the anti-globalist movement, which laments the replacement of authentic local culture with a synthetic and homogenized culture. And in 2011, the ecologist Mark A. Davis also took the lead in formulating a kind of programmatic challenge to the kind of xenophobic ideas that were in invasion biology in this article in Nature with the quite good title, Don't Judge Species on Their Origins, or a play on of Darwin's Origin of Species. And there were, it's a bit of a manifesto which was co-signed by 18 other scientists and demanded the abandonment of the, quote, native versus alien species dichotomy. And in the article, they really dispute this false claim that, quote, introduced species pose an apocalyptic threat to biodiversity, since the scientific data actually shows that the introduction of non-native species has almost always increased the number of species in the region. So, it's a much more complex question around the movement of species and how much it affects biodiversity than the invasion biologists originally stated. So this new wave of environmental thinking, which runs counter to Cold War invasion biology, has even gone to the lengths of proposing the term guest species to denote those beneficial, quote, non-native species that we welcome into our ecosystem, and really has recognized the integral role of newcomer plants in the dynamic response of the natural world to the intensifying ecological crisis. And advocates of what is also called the New Wild see signs of natural resilience in the strength and colonizing abilities of alien species. And environmentalists have also noted the way newcomers or alien species also become very quickly the new natives in ecosystems, in novel ecosystems that combine introduced and indigenous species as well, varieties. They're also kind of putting more emphasis on the agency of plants in transforming and changing environments and moving in response to anthropogenic climate change. And really is this rapidly changing ecological circumstances as a result of climate change that challenge and reverse the kind of biased and prejudicial assumptions of invasion biology. And I could also mention here ecologist Chris D. Thomas, who observed that in response to climate disruption, around 2/3 of the species that researchers have studied in recent decades have shifted their distribution, becoming commoner in those places where the climate has improved for them. And he also goes on to predict that in the long run, it's the species that keep moving and successfully exploit new environments that will survive and prosper, and thus ensure the survival of their kin on planet Earth. So it really is anthropogenic alterations to habitats and climate chaos that in a way means that we have to not just be sort of nostalgic about the past, but embrace these kind of novel assemblages of human and non-human entities, and to find ways to accommodate these new forms of coexistence brought by the movement of species as a response to anthropogenic climate change. So this is kind of this has been an introduction, quite a long introduction, but now to summarize again, what I'd like to do here is to explore some artistic practices and contemporary research-based artist practices that investigate these changing attitudes to newcomer plants. And what they do is a lot of these artworks uncover the ideological origins of the scientific construct of botanical invasiveness. They also reveal the cases of this demonization of migrant species, looking back to the era of totalitarianism, and also looking at this current era of late liberalism and anti-globalist populism. So they're finding connections between them. Artists also distinguish between arbitrary kind of projections onto resettled species and the actual evidence, evidence of environmental histories, which show the entwinement of social and natural processes. And art projects really that have dealt with the problem of invasives have challenged this vilification, this hatred towards plant migration in the politically imaginary. In some cases, art projects, such projects have also expanded to include a more sort of activist agenda, and by creating situations for communities to learn about the ecological function and practical or culinary uses of newcomer species, or this has also entailed proposing restorative actions to work with introduced organisms to rewild or restore post-industrial wastelands typically. And these sort of art projects, if you want to go a step further, they also raise the question of whether the kind of newfound empathy for incoming plants, which we can feel as well on the rise, is anything more than really just a pragmatic acknowledgement of the potential use of such plants in mitigating climate change, climate disorder, whether it's just kind of, in a way, another version of human self-interest, or whether we can see some kind of broader ecological solidarities or multi-species convergences in a sort of a spirit of post-anthropocentric cosmopolitics also emerging from this. So to go to some of these artistic examples, contemporary artistic examples that we can look at. London-based Polish artist Alicia Rogalska, also based in Berlin, has uncovered the contradictions of these routinely applied distinctions between the notion of native and non-native, as attributed to both plants and people in this work, Alien Species, Jersey Migrant Worker Archive. And the work referred in its title to the Aliens Restriction Act of 1920, which imposed strict conditions on all foreign nationals living in Jersey, which is an island in the English Channel, excuse me, including the families and children of agricultural workers who all had to carry alien cards until the 1960s. And this work that she did was at this particular moment, after the Brexit vote, but before the effects have really gone on, really kind of were seen in the economy. And it was really a high point of migrant laborers for Eastern Europe working on the island of Jersey to pick this very important crop for Jersey, the Royal Jersey potato, which actually had a European Union protected designation of origin, PDO trademark as well. It was like a specially recognized crop. And what she pointed out in her project, what she was investigating, that was although these migrant workers contributed a lot to the island's economy, they were completely absent from public representations of the culture of the island. They were just there to work. And she initiated an archive to collect, to mark their presence, an archive of the presence of this migrant agricultural community of mostly Polish and East European pickers, potato pickers, using their personal photos, mobile phone footage to kind of record their seasonal work and everyday life. And she created an archive and did various workshops also expanding on that. And what she was really showing with this project was that while this plant species, which obviously came from the Americas and actually had only been cultivated on the island since the 19th century, has sort of been accepted into this pantheon of authenticity, of being celebrated as being really very, very welcomed into the culture of Jersey. The migrant workers were at the same time experiencing social discrimination and cultural invisibility. So again, it sort of turns it round and puts a different light on the question. And her work, her intervention also shows this complex interplay between this politics of civic and botanical classification. And if we look back, there are also historical roots to this discussion, or this problematic that she examines in the botanical writings of the early 19th century, when there's got the science of recording plants and botany was really developing. And you could look, for example, there's a book, 1835 book on the rarer plants of Britain, which notes that there's a distinction in common law between native and alien. And this kind of distinction was then put onto plants. So the author of this book, Rarer Plants of Britain, states that species originally introduced by human agency that presently exist in a wild state now constitute a part of the British flora with as much claim as the descendants of Saxons or Normans to be considered a part of the British nation. So what's interesting here is, like, in the 1830s, this kind of pre-Darwinian moment, the early botanists could actually welcome or accept the presence of non-native species, which kind of shows that this hostility to non-native species somehow developed afterwards and is associated with the rise of nationalism. Maybe just a word about the potato plant. So potato plant was very much involved in these contested histories of colonial exploitation of people, animals and plants during the global transfers of the 16th and 17th century, which environmental historians and historians have referred to as the Columbian Exchange, but which is a rather neutral term for something which, as Catherine Yusof has pointed out, was actually directed colonial violence, a forced eviction from land and enslavement on plantations that accompany this European conquest of the Americas. And the potato, which was cultivated over millennia by the indigenous peoples of the Andes. It's interesting that when they actually first transferred the potato to Europe, in the 17th century, it was seen as something which was it was just fed to animals, was animal fodder, or in times of famine that humans would actually eat the potato. And it's over much since then it's become much more prized as a food. And obviously, while the potato came to Europe, then all kinds of devastating illnesses went the other direction to indigenous populations. So in a way, the negativity towards the indigenous populations was projected also onto the potato, which kind of explains why it was just seen as animal fodder and not really valued at the beginning in the 16th and 17th century. So again, this interplay of the negative attitudes towards non-white populations and foreigners then projected onto the plants. And we could look at just to mention briefly an artwork which complicates these accounts of human plant histories even further. So in her long-term project Seeds of Change, Maria Teresa Alves also looked into this transcontinental history of ballast flora. So she looks at the journeys of seeds which are hidden in the soil, sand and rocks, which are loaded onto empty cargo ships, and then they were unloaded onto their arrival in port, allowing these dormant seeds to move to new places. So they kind of accidentally transferred between continents. And this invisible movement of seeds, in her research, she discovered it was very much linked to the triangular trade of the slave trade of Africans. So from the mid 18th century, what she found out was that the slave traders found it more profitable to sail empty on the trip back from America to Europe, and so they had to load their ships with ballast to make them stable. And it was this ballast that was carried across the Atlantic, which brought the seeds. And what she did is she really charted the survival of these seeds and the history of these seeds. And she looked at different European port cities involved in the slave trade, such as Marseille, Liverpool, Dunkirk, and Bristol. And it was really this project. It brings to mind the kind of more than human temporalities of plants, which enable seeds to remain dormant for decades or even centuries before germinating. So this kind of hostile attitude to newcomer species, which as we had a look at, also kind of colored 20th century invasion biology. The other side of that was the rise of political ideologies, which really fetishized the purity of national plant varieties. So this is sort of the other side of it. And Vienna-based German artist Christian Cosmos Meyer's work, The Life Story of Cornelius Johnson's Olympic Oak and Other Matters of Survival, really looked into this an extreme case of the instrumentalization of plants as a tool of political propaganda, and really opened up some of these complex questions around purity that the history of these trees raises. So what he took as the starting point was this strange historical curiosity that the winners at the 1936 Berlin Olympics were obviously in the era of the Nazis, were awarded not just a medal, but also they received an oak sapling, so a small oak tree, as a prize. And Hitler was actually meant to give the winners the oak tree and the medal at the same time. And when Cornelius Johnson, the African-American holder of a new Olympic record in the long jump, went up, the Nazi leader avoided having to greet him or give him the oak or the medal by going back into the stadium. And it's a complex story, but one thing that Christian Maja did is he traced Johnson's oak. So he did receive the oak sapling. He traced the history of it, and he managed to locate the actual tree, which had grown up into a tree in the backyard of a small house in Los Angeles, in an area which is now known as Koreatown. and it was actually being cared for by a Mexican family that emigrated to California in the 70s. So he, investigated and kind of shed light on lots of aspects of this, of the history of this oak tree. One thing that he did in the work is that he commissioned biologists to clone small shoots from the oak tree, because the tree couldn't actually reproduce naturally because of the different climate conditions in California. So they kind of used genetic methods to clone the oak tree, and these cloned oak cuttings were then brought back to Europe for his exhibition in Vienna, in the Ludwig Museum in Vienna, as part of his installation. And he also referred in the installation to the history of the oak and of the experiences of racism of the athlete in his installation. So, but really what he's doing here in this work, what he was doing is unmasking the racist ideology of Nazism at work in the awarding of oak saplings, and showing the kind of contradiction between the way the Nazis tried to use the oak as a symbol of racial purity and Aryan supremacy, and the fact that the oak tree is actually native to most of Europe west of the Caucasus, and then there are a lot of different rival national claims to the tree. Everyone, also the English and so on, claim the oak as a sort of national tree. It's also interesting that the language that the Nazis used about these about the oak trees, the need to sort of defend the oak tree, is not so different from invasion biology. So just for example, the Nazi botanists, they were also waging a war against a small balsam tree, which they found was a non-native invader, and they said, this is the words of Nazi botanists, that as with the fight against Bolshevism, our entire Occidental culture is at stake, so with the fight against this Mongolian invader, an essential element of this culture, our forest is at stake. So it's the same feeling of the foreign invader that you can feel in Nazi racist botany. It also echoes through into invasion biology. So to take another artistic example, and this is Cooking Section's work, the next invasive is native, and this really uncovers another historical trajectory of plant migration, also hostile attitudes to newcomer plants, by looking at, as you may, I don't know if you recognize this plant or not, but it looks at the hysteria around the spread of Japanese knotweed in the United Kingdom, where, and their work took the form of a durational reading session, these two voices. It was a performative lecture, and what they did in the lectures, they kind of juxtaposed the representations in the media, especially of this hidden threat of the most invasive, killer, aggressive, horror weed, with very detailed, careful analysis of its actual, the real complex natural and cultural history of the plant, and the way that was embedded in economic and urbanistic processes in the United Kingdom, and also looking at its journey to the UK. And what they revealed is the Japanese knotweed, before it began this basically imaginary attack on British suburbia, had actually been a kind of a prized addition to Victorian landscape gardens, and it was actually introduced to the country by an anonymous donation, or an unsolicited donation, to the botanical collections at Kew in 1850, and then it went to the Victorian landscape gardens. And then what happened is it escaped into the wild. It crossed the fence and established itself in waste dumps by the edge of railways, in graveyards across the country. And by the 70s, the epicenter of this supposed knotweed invasion was the Welsh city of Swansea, a kind of post-industrial city. And there was these lead and sulfur polluted soils of derelict factories, perfect for the spread of a plant, which actually, if it's comes from Japan, and actually where its original environment in Japan was the slopes of volcanoes. So it's very good at kind of colonizing nutrient pure lava slopes of Japanese volcanoes. And so one line of this performative lecture of cooking sections is Empire Redesign the Wild, and something that they're really interested in the interference of colonial legacies with the global distribution of plants, and especially food plants. And you know, as a kind of tiny bit of context to the work, it actually took place within the Empire Remains shop larger project that they ran. And what they did, they had a temporary project space on Baker Street in London, and which was like a site for loads of performances, installations, and discussions about this idea, the idea they had about what would happen if you sold back the remains of the British Empire in London today. And what the recent cultural, environmental, and economic history of knotweed suggests is that it wasn't really about the redesign of empire. It was not about the redesign of empire by the wild, but rather the agency of the new wild in changing landscapes and reconfiguring landscapes that have been degraded by colonialism and industrial development. So again, it's about the agency and the recuperative power of plants. And you know, one other thing in this lecture, which is quite an important point about invasive species or so-called invasive species, is this idea of what point does an so-called invasive species become naturalized, is like an essential question. And they ask 3 years, 30 years, 300 years, 3,000 years, 30,000 years, and really pointing to this kind of arbitrary nature of the decision of when a plant's degree of belonging means that it's you know, it's actually accepted as a native species. And they make the point that in the long run, most native flora and plants could actually be seen as alien invaders if you look back far enough. And also they point out how climate change and the effects of humans since the Columbian Exchange have been really had a massive influence in increasing the transfer of plants between distant locations. And in effect, as a result of globalization, they say we are reuniting the biological world to create a new Pangaea, kind of one single entity of the earth. So another project I'd like to just share with you, which really talks about the arbitrariness of the way in which resettled species are adopted or rejected by populist political movements, is Benszegye's Palenkas and Christoph Kellermann's work, Hungarian Acacia. And the work takes the form of what they call a post-fact documentary theatre piece. And it tells the story of an alien species that became Hungary's most patriotic tree. So this tree, the black locust or false acacia tree, actually arrived in Hungary 300 years ago from North America at the height of the so-called Columbian Exchange. And as is often the case with these newcomer species, it first spread in you know, the gardens of aristocrats, and then it spread across the country, and it's become what a survey revealed that 63% of Hungarians consider it to be the most Hungarian tree. So the acacia tree, although it was a newcomer, is already totally accepted as the most Hungarian tree by the population. And in 2014, the European Union was discussing placing the false acacia tree on a kind of blacklist for the prevention and management of the introduction and spread of invasive alien species. And what happened was rather surprisingly, the Hungarian government reacted against this and came to the defense of the black locust tree. And Viktor Orban's party, you know, which they've been on the brink also of thinking about eradicating it. They're also following the ideas of invasion biology, but then they did a switch and they said, they declared, "We send this message to Brussels. We are protecting the Hungarian land, free palinka brandy distillation, honey, and the black locust tree." So in a way, in fact, the right-wing government went one step further by pronouncing the tree to be a Hungaricum, a kind of, which was an official brand for entities of cultural, culinary, or strategic significance to the Hungarian nation. And if you think about, this is the time, 2017, 16, 17, this is a time when the country itself, the ruling nationalists, were putting out razor wire fences along the border to keep out refugees. And at the same time, they were admitting this introduced species of the acacia tree to the national pantheon as being like a very authentic Hungarian tree. And this the theatrical piece that they produced, theatrical production, Hungarian Acacia, really it involved like choral chanting, slam poetry, and it was like multimedia projections, and it dramatized the entangled natural and human histories of the tree and the way the tree had been manipulated in the political arena. And what was quite clever is that the piece really pushed this kind of nationalist intentions of the official campaign to co-opt the black locust tree by pushing this to its logical conclusion. So they say that if the black locust could become a Hungaricum, then anybody who can take root in Hungarian soil can become Hungarian. So it had quite a kind of political charge to it, their work as well. And they also took the campaign outside the theatre. They organized tree planting meetings as a focus for social mobilization. And the black locust tree then somehow became a symbol for a more open, multicultural and tolerant society, which was a real contrast to the anti-immigrants policy and rhetoric that was spreading within Europe, not just in Hungary, within Europe at the time. So, and maybe just to mention one other work that they did, as you can see, the flute that is being played here. So the performance also included musical instruments carved from non-native species. And what you can see is a recorder made from the black locust tree. And in a related work of Emigrant Melodies, Bence Palankas, also with another artist, Kitty Kostala, drew on this practice of traditional folk musicians who basically select the material to make their instruments from the plants around them, to carve and to make the most attractive sounds. They don't really care if it's a newcomer or it's it's like an ancient indigenous plant or not. And they also make a reference here, this connects also with the question around Nazism. They make a reference to the Hungarian composer Béla Bartók's essay, Race, Purity in Music, which was written at the height of the Second World War. And, this was a time when there was lots of talk about the purity and impurity of the human race. And the Hungarian composer and ethnomusicologist, who was researching the kind of exchanges of different emigrant melodies in Central Europe, concludes in his research in this essay that racial impurity finally attained is definitely beneficial. So he was like, in a way, pointing out that this mixture of different melodies was beneficial and going against this ideology of Nazism of purity. Showing that this cross-border movement of species, he was talking about music, but they are talking about the species, is really kind of strengthens ecosystems on the one hand, because it enriches rather than reduces biodiversity. How are we doing for time here? Oh, running low on time. So, maybe I'll just if I may, just briefly mention one other, if that's okay with time, one other artistic example. So that's from this play, and that's Diana Lelonek, Polish artist Diana Lelonek's work, Seabury Slag Heap. And what she looked at is really the way that this another so-called invasive species, which was also on this European list of banned invasive species, could also be used to restore a devastated industrial area. So the open pit mining area of the region of Konin in central Poland. And it's really the point which you can feel in a lot of these stories about so-called invasive plants, that they really come along to devastated environments and are kind of like a first stage in restoring them, whether it's the acacia tree in Hungary, which settled in like bomb sites after the Second World War. That's really when it started to spread, or it's the seabury, which spreads and manages to survive and brings back life to these areas which are destroyed through the effects of the Anthropocene and the effects of the effects of mining and massive levels of extractivism. I mean, there are other aspects of the work which I won't go into now, but really, just to conclude, so this historical demonization of newcomer species in Cold War science and also nationalist ideology, together with this more recent resurgence of these manipulated fears of invasive plants in this rhetoric of anti-globalist populism, has really been demystified by a lot of these artists, and also by scientists, so a newer generation post-invasion biology scientists. And it really is planetary crisis, the encroaching planetary crisis, which has helped focus minds on the ecological benefits brought by the new arrivals in terms of reversing biodiversity loss, and also the pioneering role of so-called invasive species in restoring these destroyed landscapes. It's really evident that the main drivers of the sixth extinction are not the mixing of non-native species, but there really are climate change and anthropogenic habitat loss, which are destroying biodiversity. It's not the movement of species around the world. And it really is non-native plants which are playing a pioneering role in rewilding extractivist sites and suburban wastelands. And contemporary artistic engagement with vegetal migrants really has showed ways of collaborating with the plant pioneers of the new wild to model different ecological transformations of these damaged sites. And really, the seriousness, the gravity of this kind of collaborations between plants and humans springs from the knowledge that if we don't take really rapid action, in the end, the course we're on in terms of climate change, it really will indiscriminately turn human and non-human Earth dwellers into climate refugees, and it will completely destroy any distinction that's left between the native and the non-native. So, thanks a lot for listening to my paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this extraordinary lecture.
Oh, and just, if I could just mention, so just a little plug of our book, which is coming out in April, and it has a whole chapter on plants on the move. So some of the examples and some other artistic examples and ideas are also developed in our book on art and climate change, coming out in April. Sorry, go on, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you. This is so interesting. Actually, I was very much inspired by your original text, which I read, and which brought me into. I actually did a research about the giant hogweed and invasive plants. The giant hogweed is a very, very much spread plant in our lands, and so I confronted myself with the specialists who are in this field, the biologists, and actually the argument was I was accused of being too romantic, and that these plants are really seriously harming the environment, which is kind of I think it's a kind of open discussion still for me, not for them actually. They have established also there's like a network of people who are trying to eradicate these plants systematically in Europe at least, and they're working in other continents. I think it's a very, very interesting discussion. I think there are more questions than answers probably, but I think it's really interesting how it triggers the imagination, and I think in particular in this approach, it's quite interesting how it stimulates where this intersection between the arts and the reality is really interesting. How we can approach this problem in very various approaches, as you were showing. Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting how scientists kind of they sort of feel that they're dealing with something objective. You're saying that they have established that these very invasive and dangerous plants. But it's not just a purely objective discussion, because the debate is changing, and because there are so many kind of other factors which help shape, historically, if we look at the history of science, help shape this mentality, this hostility towards newcomer species. So yeah.
Actually, I was for the whole time as I was listening to you, I was kind of trying to conclude what kind of question, and I was just, you concluded it just before I was about to ask, in the way that you were saying that maybe these plants might help in the way that we will very soon might become refugees of the climate change, and exactly these plants could help us actually, because they are very, very alive. They can help us to cover these places that were the mines, etc., that were destroyed because of the human activity. Probably. There's a question.
Hello, sir. My name is Sindra. I help to co-organize this symposium. I am actually a scientist, but I shifted from invasion biology to studying colors of animals. And I have a couple of notes. It's a pity, because this would be for a very long discussion. So it's pity that we don't have much time. But now you were saying that the scientists claim that they have something objective, but really it's not. That it is like a spirit of time. But I would disagree with this, and also with other conclusions you made during the talk, because even now, I mean, like now we are in really strange time. But let's say 10 years ago or something like this, there were, and I agree that this is not really good. The papers about the invasion biology always start with the impact and how much we pay for it, and how it is important for the native species to not have it there, and so on. I mean, like, this may be a little bit exaggerated, but I think this is because of selling of the papers, not really like the scientists themselves would like to eradicate the alien species, but really to emphasize that this is an important topic that deserves much attention. And maybe it's not really like the science about the alien species which is wrong, but it's an overall setup of things being sold to the public, that public needs to have some special attention to a problem to really start to care about. On the other hand, there is this really the impact of the alien species, which really it can be shown that, for example, there is a decline of biodiversity at some microhabitat scale, which really matters, because the decline of the diversity leads to the habitats being vulnerable to changes. And then you were speaking about the climate change. So when the diversity declines and then there is a change, maybe we can end up in some kind of like desert, instead of having at least some diversity still there. So this is really problematic topic. And I mean, it's important that you discuss this with politics. But I would not really say that this was only like a communism thing, but it's also the capitalism thing, that it's causing these exaggerations of the problem, which is not really political problem, it's biological problem. So what would you say about this? Like, the times change, the attitudes change. I mean, it's in different regions. We have different attitudes. I mean, like the dictator regimes have different attitudes, and the democratic regimes have different attitudes. But the narrative about the invasive plants still remains. So I don't know if this is really matter of the spirit of time, or it is really some objective matter?
I mean, thanks a lot for all those points, and really pointing to the you're pointing to the complexity of the fact you've got maybe in such a short presentation, it's possible to for the sake of the argument to overstress one aspect or another, but I think that it's probably true that you could agree that the debate over this kind of scientific language and discussion and discourse around invasive species, and you said you were in invasion biology before, was influenced, at least to some extent, by some of these fears around the spread of things spreading out of control, which could also be part of the Cold War, as I tried to show, kind of Cold War dichotomies of like fears of the spread of communism from a Western perspective, or also similar fears from the eastern side of the Iron Curtain. So it was somehow it wasn't in isolation. I think that that's why I showed that at the beginning, that text from '58, which you can really feel that there was a scientist. The way they were talking about science was very much connecting it to debates and questions, more general ones around the Cold War. So I think that this the fear of and the kind of hostile attitude to invasive species, you can feel it in a lot of different contexts, which I tried to show, from its origins in the 19th century. It's the way it was used by Nazism as maybe the most extreme case of the kind of instrumentalization or weaponization of this scientific idea of invasive species by the Nazis, and also on both sides of the Cold War, and also after the Cold War. So that's also what I think is quite interesting, that even in the 90s, in the current kind of language of the European list of introduced and for stopping the spread of invasive species, you do feel the continuity of this kind of exaggerated fear of the threat of new species coming in. And in a way, that's the dialogue, the discourse of invasion biology. But there's also been a change in it, which I also tried to point to, in that more scientists, more recently have also created a more balanced account of the effects of newcomer species, and this that doesn't necessarily lead to a decrease in biodiversity, but can lead to the opposite, to an increase in biodiversity when species come to an area. And obviously there are some contexts, as you said, some microclimates where this maybe not the case, maybe certain lake ecosystems and so on, where you can see newcomer species have a very negative effect on biodiversity. But climate change is really, I think the point I wanted to make is really is really mixing up and changing these discussions very rapidly. And you can't even native species, so-called native species, indigenous species, under the effects of climate change, can also suddenly turn to become much more aggressive and can become a danger to a particular microenvironment where they were in balance, for centuries or millennia. So climate change can also change their behavior and make them just as much as a threat as any non-native species. So it's really not about the, the title of this journal article I mentioned, Don't Judge a Species by Its Origins. I mean, it's really about what it does and what its effect is in the environment, which is something that we should concentrate on, rather than using this language of outside foreign species, which is somehow is not that useful either environmentally or in terms of its implications, its political implications as well. And I think that there is a turn. I think artists are at the forefront of that in many ways in developing new ideas towards these species. So when we think about species moving, you can also see them as climate refugees, as species who are forced to move. There's the idea of some also debates, which I'm sure you're aware of, around the assisted migration of species whose current environment has become unlivable because of anthropogenic climate change. So the huge trees in California, like people are trying to assist them to move further to say, because they can't move quick enough because climate change is so quick. So this also creates all kinds of complex issues about whether we should just like let things proceed on their own, or should we also help species to migrate? So all these questions are getting more and more complex as a result of climate change. And really the argument we're trying to make was that both artists and a new generation of scientists are developing new attitudes or thinking about these newcomer species in new ways, and trying to think about them without this burden of a kind of hostility, a sort of ingrained hostility, a sort of instinctive hostility, because it's a newcomer, because it's a foreign plant, we should somehow have put some negative feelings onto it, but actually to think of it in different ways. And there are parallels there with the need to be more open to climate refugees, human climate refugees, and other people who are forced to move because of this situation, which is no fault of their own either. So, you know, the political and the social issues and the environmental issues and questions around the species are all very much mixed up at the moment. And I think that the artists are doing a good job of somehow of illuminating the complexity of the situation, and as a kind of barometer of how these attitudes to newcomer plants are changing.
Thank you. I mean, I would have that would be for a long discussion, but I mean, I'm convinced that the discussion is necessary, but we don't have time, unfortunately. So, thank you.
Thank you a lot.
Are there
a conclusion, upon a conclusion, just the final one, that this is exactly what is it's really interesting to observe how the art practice and the exactitude of the sciences is kind of shifting backwards, forwards, and it really is, I think, fruitful to where art could contribute to the change of thinking in this way. Yeah, concretely. Reuben, thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you. Thank you.